Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming to what I think is the last of the many sessions on AI at this conference, and on a sunny afternoon. This one is called Journalism GPT, which maybe is just a provocative name for a panel discussion, or maybe is our shared future. Perhaps we can try and shed some light on that during the course of this discussion. I last spoke about AI here in Perugia in 2018. The room was a lot smaller and the crowd was a lot smaller, so something's obviously going on. My name is Gary Rogers. I am a senior newsroom strategy consultant with Fathom, which is a newsroom innovation consultancy based in London. In a previous life, in 2018, I was talking about Radar AI, which was a local journalism startup I did, which produced data stories at scale, because the small team of reporters use NLG, natural language generation templates, to scale up their work and produce tens of thousands of stories for local news in the UK every year. And that's still operating and is, I think, a good example of AI deployed in action. The panel I have sitting alongside me today, like me, has been delving into the AI world for a number of years. So they're exactly the people you need to be listening to and the people who I talk to when I need to work something out. What we're going to try to do today is talk about some of the practical realities of what we're heading into. We're going to talk about disruptions to organizations and to individuals, to all of you in the room. We're going to talk about the practical challenges of deployment if we do decide to follow an AI path in our newsrooms. And I want us to talk a little bit about audience benefit, because I think there are opportunities that we can deliver greater value to audiences, but sometimes in the AI in news conversation, we forget about the audience as we worry about ourselves, and I think we need to switch that a little bit. So these are the people, because doing that sort of thing is their day job, and so I'd like them all to just take a moment to introduce themselves and tell you who they are. So, Jess, off you go.
Hello, I'm Jessica Davis, and I work with Gannett and USA Today. In the US, we have 200 plus local newsrooms from coast to coast. And I was just named lead for AI automation product for Gannett USA Today. So started in a newsroom role, and now, maybe that says a little bit about where we think it's heading. But it's really great to be here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Uli Kappen. I'm part of German Public Broadcasting, and I'm a journalist. I'm co-leading 3 teams, and we are into data investigation with AI and automation. So we're looking somehow at the dark side of AI. And also we are trying to think about and use AI and automation for journalism. This is for automated products, automated texts, graphics, automated news briefings. And we're taking what we learned there from our prototypes to embed it into our digital strategy as a broadcaster, and then feed it back to our prototypes. So, up to you, David.
Hello, I'm David Caswell. I'm an executive product manager at BBC News, and I've been with the BBC for going on 5 years. And that time has been about innovation in news, first in a team called News Labs, and then more recently in the production side, the infrastructure that enables kind of moving that innovation out into production. And then I've got this small parallel academic career around computational journalism, and specifically ways to use structure and AI in journalism to do new things for audiences. And so that's who I am.
Thanks very much. What I'd like to do as well is, before we get stuck in, I'd like to read the room a little bit. I'd like to know who we're talking to here. So if I think about my conversations I've had with journalists around AI, they fall into 2 broad categories. I'm very excited about what this might lead to and the possibilities, and I'm terribly anxious about all sorts of things, including my job and where the hell the industry's going with this. So I know that many people think both those things, but for the sake of this very basic show of hands sentiment exercise, I'd like you to pick one of those that you feel you sit closer to. So can I have a show of hands for people who are excited about the possibilities of an AI journalism future? Okay, and let's hear from the worried, anxious folk. There's some worried, anxious folk in the room as well. Okay. Yep, good, good. So we might revisit that as a sort of panel feedback to see whether we've excited you or made you just really anxious. So now I'm going to start with David, because I think David falls really into the quite excited category. He's done a lot of work in playing with tools and publishing his results. And if you follow David on Twitter, you'll see the last thing he did last night in his spare time when he had a few moments to play around. So David, is this a hype, or is journalism GPT really part of the future of news for the people sitting in this room?
So I think sometimes when you kind of talk about the hype question, there's this sense that it's an or, that it's either this is sort of a very, very important real thing, or it's hype. And I think that's not what's happening now. We're in an and situation. So this, I think, is a fundamentally important structural change in our societies as well as in journalism, and it's hype. The hype cycle right now is becoming a little bit silly. There's a phrase from a science fiction author, either William Gibson or Neil Stephenson, I can't remember which, that's kind of a cliche, that we tend to overestimate change in the short term, but underestimate it in the long term. And I think that's very, very, very applicable here. In our pre-conversations around this panel, there was a phrase that I used that I think got Gary's attention, that I really stand by, which is I think this is going to change journalism more in the next 3 years than journalism has changed in the last 30 years. And I say that knowing how much journalism has changed in the last 30 years. And the reason I think that is because what this is changing, or what this is messing with, is the fundamental unit of journalism, which has so far been predominantly the article and sort of audio and video equivalents and so on. But what this is doing is it is for the first time enabling that to be broken apart. And there's very little friction to doing that, very little technical difficulty or behavioral difficulty in doing that. And so that's what I believe with that.
What you all have to know, David is the inventor, I would say, of modular journalism. So he's very much into this Lego or puzzle structure of journalism. And would you say, that would be my question for you, that AI breaks it down even more into tokens, so to say?
Well, so AI does work with tokens, but I don't think tokens are the interesting thing for journalism. I think the question that's in my mind is that if we've had this period since basically the 1640s, 1650s, where the article, this sort of block of text that describes some information, has been the unit of news, the thing, the artifact or the container for news. If we move into a world where anybody can summarize or rewrite or combine or do whatever they want with news media, then what becomes the new standard container of news? It's very quickly not going to be the article. You can see this already in things like Bing Chat or Perplexity AI, where these tools are sort of taking news from lots of different places and combining it and summarizing it and doing different stylistic things with it. And this is just the first few months of this stuff. You carry that on 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, and like, what's the permanent unit of news? What's the atom of news at that point? I think it's bigger than tokens, but I think it's a lot smaller than articles.
I want to come back to some of this because I think it affects how journalists work and the skills they need and the tasks they will do. And I want to come back to that. But before we get into that detail, I'd like to know a little bit about what each of you in your organizations. If David's saying there's a 3-year timeline of change here.
5, 3.
Yeah, but we're talking about something that needs to happen quite rapidly. And that probably needs to start today, or probably started yesterday. So tell me a little bit about what within your own organizations, a commercial newspaper publisher and some public broadcasters here, what's going on in your organization about this? Activity, panic, status, what's happening? Jess, what's happening in Gannett?
I think people are very interested and showing a lot of curiosity around this. I think in that earlier prep conversation, we all talked about we're being asked by our organization quite a lot of questions, which is what we want from our journalists, right? We want to be cautious but curious when, there's the question, is this hype or is this a real thing? But really what we're doing is really trying to look at it as these are tools for our journalists. And so, I'm seeing it as a cultural change issue partially. There's a lot of other things you can layer in we could spend hours talking about. But I think ultimately when it's about what's the vision for how can this be additive to our journalism, how could it help free up our journalists, because we've been in automation heavily for a while, we have a cultural change process in place where, hey, let's try something, right? Let's work with the journalists and say, okay, let's make a specific time-bound, let's try an experiment. Let's be mindful of what it is and what it isn't and learn from it. And so I'm working with several of our large and small newsrooms right now, our national Pub USA Today and some of our more local newsrooms on very specific, both automation, because we've been doing that for some time with our localizer project, inspired by what radar I did in the UK, where we've been publishing data-driven articles for our 200 plus newsrooms for the last several years, and had a wonderful audience response to that, where journalists write the templates. And so there's a lot of others to hear from today, but just that process of making sure journalists, understand what this is and what it isn't. When we are specific about, hey, let's take an article and make it less work for you to do, but just as high of quality, just as high of accuracy, or alternate formats. I'll let the others speak to their innovation in that. Let's work together is an invitation for to remove some of the fear and understand, okay, I need to understand, for the data-driven stories, when we collaborate, we need their expertise on real estate for the real estate stories, or we need their expertise on their subject matter to make those stories accurate for all our newsrooms. So I think that's really what we're focused on now, is just laying out the near and long term what we want to do. And I'll pass it to my next panelist.
So Uli, you lead a lab. How much of the focus of the lab currently has gone on to the GPT area of AI and the language model basis of AI? What are you doing in that particular space?
Of course, we're experimenting a lot, and we have one person in the lab. He's a natural language generation expert, so he uses his knowledge on computer linguistics to use those tools. And of course, we have been experimenting around generating language for a long time now. So we use different frameworks, for example, frameworks that give you the grammar and that are connected to databases. And with those frameworks we have been working before, you don't have the problem of hallucination. I don't know if everyone in the room knows what hallucination is, but just a short definition. It adds certain data to the output that hasn't been part of the training data. So it's false facts. And this, of course, is a problem when you work with generative AI in journalism. If you have to make your newsroom fact check every bit in the output, then you really have to think it through where you can use it. Because when we work, for example, with our summarizer tool we have built way before ChatGPT, and we are asking our journalists, where do you want to use it? They say, I really have to be faster with that. And when they have to fact check every bit, they would never use that. So you have to think through where you can use this kind of technology. And right now, we are, of course, testing fast. But really integrating that in your production process is a completely different thing. And for now, for our use cases, we would not integrate user-facing, meaning our users out there and our journalists in the newsroom we wouldn't use ChatGPT for that. ChatGPT for us is something where you can get ideas, where you can test out personalizing styles of texts. And of course, we're playing around with it like you're doing. But really getting that into infrastructure is a completely different thing. I guess we're discussing that a little bit broader.
Yeah, I think that's one of the sort of the realizations that people who are kind of playing with these tools kind of come to sooner or later is that you can take, for example, an article and you can reversion that into 20 different versions, different styles, summaries, graphical stories, scripts, audio products, video products, and so on. And there's all of these synthetic tools that can do that. But then what? What you need infrastructure to be able to use the correct version for the correct audience in a way that's valuable to audiences. And that's not just sort of the content management system. That's the how do you curate that stuff? How do you recommend it? How do you, if you have recommendations and you have 20 different versions of every piece of news content, created for different audiences, how do you deal with that? How do you serve it? All of these are very kind of boring technical questions, but to take advantage of what you can do with these tools, playing around as an individual, which is so easy, and then do that at scale for tens of millions of people, it's an entirely different set of problems, and they're more boring and more technical and not as visual.
So we should have called it boring GPT.
No, it's the necessity of dealing with how to make GPT useful at scale. Like how do you bring it into people's lives in a routine, normal way? That takes more than a chatbot. It takes systems and I think policy is a big part of this. I think in one of the things I've been really gratified by at the BBC is the level and sophistication of engagement by our editorial policy people. I think that's a big piece of infrastructure that's important here as well.
And you're very engaged with actual hands-on with tools at the moment and trying to do with things with these things. How far is the BBC going with this? Is it at policy and guideline level and experimentation, or where's the push at the moment within BBC News?
Mainly policy. I think, so we've done a lot of prototyping work. We've been working with the OpenAI model since 2019. GPT-2 was the first one I got my hands on. But I think there's an unusual, and there's opportunity at the BBC. I mean, we have this requirement to serve everybody in the country, and they're all very different, so reversioning our journalism kind of makes sense from that point of view. But on the other hand, our unique selling proposition, our kind of differentiation, the thing that makes us special in many ways is trust. We're a very high trust brand. We're the most trusted news brand in the US, for example, and we've decided to double down on that trust and maybe being kind of first out the door with exciting uses of generative AI might not be the best compatible. So I think,
yes.
I'm not privy to all the sort of strategic discussions and everything, but I think we might be cautious about this and be maybe a fast follower rather than a leader or something like that.
Jess, is this a similar thing for you? Is trust eroded by too quicker experiments with new technologies?
Oh, it certainly can. But I also think that as we're assessing, right, okay, what do these tools do? How do they align, with our values as an organization? But when it comes to, okay, but what does it create, right? There's fear around that, but when we get in there and we prompt the AI or, we write the template for the natural language generation story, what we found is that our very specific, relevant, geographically local stories that we create with the natural language generation, they engage audiences at incredibly high rates, even higher than the average of, just a regular reporter writing a story. Why? It's a data story, right? It has context, it has relevance to people. And so being able to do that at scale, this is specific to your community. So an example of what we've done in the past, the unemployment stories, so a monthly, a weekly unemployment trend story. We actually wound that down in 2021 because the audience interest died off, but we're of course talking about bringing that back. And so it's that prism of, hey, what questions is our audience asking? And, how can we free up our journalists to do their most impactful work? And for us, templated NLG is a tool in our toolkit that, we're excited about, that we're getting more and more of our journalists to work with. And then from there, with that adoption, the next step of, okay, fully automating some of these things, the next step of generative isn't as far off when you have that human in the loop, right? We're experimenting, we're working together across the organization. That's so, like, that audience value, though, is what convinces the journalist to keep working with us on it. Right, this is going to help me reach my goals. this helps my, I'll put a link to my, analysis story in the data-driven one that's automated, and actually people do click through at really high rates, and so it benefits everybody, and really helps us.
Uli, what about you? You do things with labs. You do good experiments, you get interesting results, and then you try and roll them into the newsroom, and the newsroom treasures its relationship of trust with its audience, and you're a public service media outlet. How do you balance that sort of the need to do new and the need to try to serve an audience better with the need to retain that trust relationship?
This is more or less in the center of what we are doing. All what we are doing with technology is user-focused. So we are not using technology for the sake of it. It's part of our guidelines. We also published our AI guidelines already 3 years ago. So this is the center also of our guidelines, that there really has to be something in it for our users and for our journalists. So this is somehow the guiding principle. Mm-hmm. And what you just said, Jessica, this is something I want to underscore. I would love to look at AI and automation as a broader set of tools. I guess only the question, what can we do with generative AI, and then get a little bit desperate because, well, false facts, and then we have to fact check, and then only for ideas. The thing is, we really are in a watershed moment for AI and automation right now. It's a great moment to lobby for automation in the newsroom and to combine it with your USP digitally, which means at first we have to look at our USP and understand what do we want to do with technology and then use it for it. What you just said, you're trying to create regionalized stories with natural language generation frameworks. We had very good experiences with that. So we are not only generating one story, but we're generating 96 stories for every county, for example, for elections, for economic stories, for sports. You all know that this is kind of boring because it's around for 5 or 6 years. But this really is the foundation of what we can do with AI and automation. We can make the news experience more seamless for our users, I would say. And the more seamless it is, the more successful we are as a newsroom, because we are, and that was on another panel yesterday, as journalists, we are selling focus. And I really love this idea of selling focus. And when we can, support that with technology, we should do that, and automation serves us there very well.
David, can I pick this up with you? Because you and I have discussed what's the next thing for journalism to try to get its head around is that customization and the more personalized news feed and how we deliver that. Does a push into automation technologies and AI technologies really enable that? Are we going to be able to deliver in the near future a customized news feed for every user?
Yeah, I think we are, and I think there's evidence, including right here on this panel from our experience, and also at the BBC with the work we've done with customized stories, that you can do this stuff. Audiences respond very well to this. There's opportunities from generative AI to expand and increase the scale and the scope and the richness of these kind of stories. I think there are other questions that BBC, this is kind of front of mind with this, is this balancing of sort of a national conversation with maybe local or personalization and customization based on other characteristics, and sort of having a customized experience, but also a shared experience, because that's kind of also part of what journalism does. So I think there's a lot of sort of uncertainty there, or things that are still to be not even figured out, but just kind of understood what the questions are. That's a lot easier for like local publications who are just by their very nature customized to a locality.
Yes.
And I think that's where this stuff starts. But I think inevitably, especially with once generative AI gets going, all of our news experiences are going to inevitably become more customized and more adapted to our consumption behaviors. But then, what is the commonality? What's the common narrative? What's the common kind of vision of a society that it sees itself in?
Yes.
I think there's still a lot of uncertainty there.
While an audience might value that, will they have concern about how it was made? And we have lots of issues here around transparency and about making sure there's some degree of higher media literacy about how our journalism is produced. And I know the current BBC campaign is, if you know how it's made, you'll trust it. Well, if it's being made with a large language model, who knows how it's being made?
Yeah,
And does anybody know how it's being made now?
And
So
this
is
is-
this an issue? I mean, how as
Absolutely.
news journalists and technologists are we going to tackle that issue?
Yeah, and just on the BBC situation, I mean, this is exactly why that trust is as an organization our unique selling proposition. It's one of our big unique selling propositions, and it's where we're focusing absolutely rightly on at the moment, and it's especially needed, I think, in the present time. And I do not see any possibility of us damaging that with the over-enthusiastic use of large language models, just to be completely clear there. But I think that's a different thing than the work, for example, that Gannett is doing, and many others, where there are controlled, deterministic, or very easy to understand and very easy to control ways of doing these custom stories. And those can be deployed, and a lot of the back-end infrastructure is the same, whether it's generative AI or whether it's these kind of rule-based, data story-driven, customized stories. So I think there's ways to get started in trust-supporting versions that can also help build towards more richer generative AI versions of these customized stories later when it becomes.
Jess, tell us what's Gannett's policy around transparency around anything that's got automation arranged with alongside a reporter using some sort of AI tooling in their work. What do you tell the reader about that?
Yeah, I mean, we have to be transparent. So labeling is our requirement of our journalists and ourselves. So every story you see from our localizer program has, a disclaimer at the bottom that just explains either partially the methodology of, which data source that story is pulling from, and if there was, because with natural language generation, a reporter is writing the template. You feed in the structured data, and it's like Mad Libs.
Yes.
A colleague of mine loves that analogy, and I've latched onto it. Or Choose Your Own Adventure for the more advanced ones. And so, a human is writing it. It's just automatically creating, the more specific localized version. So they all have that disclaimer. I think that is really important. That's something that differentiates, our articles from what the chatbots say. Is like we are transparent about our sourcing, and we're accountable, to the information. Especially, as humans, sometimes we get things wrong, and so we own that, and we have a process to own that. And so, the same for these stories. They follow all our guidelines.
And that's how you're going to proceed, yes?
Absolutely.
Okay. I want to go back to something that David said, which is the 3 years and 30 years thing. And as a former newsroom manager, I would describe that as strategically terrifying. And the idea that I've also got to not only change the journalism, but also fix all the plumbing that supports the journalism means it's going to be massive. Uli, do you agree that this is a very, very disruptive moment for news? And therefore, if your managers come in and say, Uli, what shall we do? What should our approach be as a news organization? How should we tackle this strategically? What do we need to do?
Then, of course, I do have all the answers. Honestly, you just stole my quote. I completely.
I'm reading your notes.
Yes. Well, I completely agree. We are way overestimating what ChatGPT does to journalism right now. But the long-term thing, that is the interesting part. The infrastructure, the APIs, the metadata. Are we having enough metadata? For us as a broadcaster, we're having video, we're having audio, we're having text. This is a crucial question for us. And the answer for all the broadcasters I know over the world is no. Our metadata is shitty. And also our legacy systems usually don't speak to each other. So what we did during the last years was we tried to do some, we call them Trojan unicorns, meaning doing projects that have the possibility to solve a bigger challenge for us. And I give you an example. We are doing a prototype called Remix Regional. It's an audio prototype that personalizes, regionalizes audio for you. We're having the audio news in a linear way, then we're taking an algorithm and we're segmenting this algorithm. We are using another algorithm to tag this and to add metadata, and then we store it. And when we succeeded down the road, when we will succeed, then we will have a data storage that will enable us to personalize audio in any way we want to. And we combine that with a prototype so that you can really see what we're up to. This is important to lobby internally, and it is also important for us to user test it. So we're user testing all along the way. I would always recommend to use prototypes if you want to solve bigger challenges like infrastructures, APIs, because then you can show this is what comes out at the end. This is what you're having as a journalist in the end from doing the tedious work of adding metadata or perhaps helping us to make machines to do the metadata. So it gives you arguments to work with the newsroom and to tackle this cultural change along the way. So this would be the positive turn now. Back to you, Gary. Now you can.
I think what worries me here is that the news industry's not got a great track record with big change. So
that was not very positive.
So no, it's not. So the digital transformation of the 90s, as a consultant, I was still working on digital transformation projects just a few years ago. So that's taken a while. The advent of social media, the news did not get that right either. A question for all of you here. Are you more confident that the news industry is going to get this right? Or are you worried that the precedents have been set and we're not so good at doing big change? We don't like it. As journalists, we don't like it. As news organizations, we don't much like it. As news organizations, we might struggle to afford it. And what you're talking about with all the experimentation we need to do to get this right, it's going to cost us quite a lot of money. And if you're a small news organization, you're even more in the trouble here, aren't you? What are we going to do about it? Are we going to get this right? How do we cope with this? Sorry, I'm strategically terrified again.
There's a quick comment I want to make there on that last thing. I actually think that one of the things that generative AI does and all these tools that go with it is they democratize the production of media, but they also democratize innovation in media. And so I think that actually smaller organizations just have as much capability. Like a lot of the stuff that I'm doing, I'm just sort of signing up for a few, $30 a month APIs and sort of having a hack at it kind of thing. And anybody can do that. Like it's not a big news organization. There's a news organization that I've seen referred to a few times that is basically a one-man news organization. It's called the Lost Coast Outpost, and it is very exciting. One person, maybe $50 a month in API fees, something like that. I don't think size and resources is quite the excuse for diving in. I think engagement and you were talking about prototyping, learning by doing, engaging, building trying things and using that to build that knowledge. That's the barrier. It's not signing up for an API.
Jess, more confident we're going to get this right?
You know, I like the questions that I'm hearing within my own organization, that I've been hearing in conversations at this conference. So I can't help but be cautiously optimistic that we, you know, I think how I usually solve problems in newsrooms is let's follow the audience data.
Yeah.
And if we're rigorous and disciplined about that, we can learn so much so quickly if we're just kind to ourselves and willing to try, right, with our standards and our ethics and our guidelines at the forefront. I think this is an exciting time to be a journalist, to be experimental, and you know, I really see that part of it as lower risk for us. I don't want the journalists in Gannett or anywhere to be afraid. I want them to be, again, cautious but curious.
Yeah, okay.
And that's why I'm not, you know, yes, there's a lot to do, and we need to work on it. But
Let's pick that up for journalists in every newsroom, people in this room. We've talked about disruption to an organizational sense. It's disruption on a human level. So if someone at the end of this session comes up to you now and says, I'm a journalist and I work in a newsroom and I need to think about how I better equip myself to live in an AI newsroom, you give them a pointer each. You know, what's the one thing you'd say go and try and do, or to think, or is it attitude, is it skill? Is the job going to change if they're going to say goodbye to a few things and say hello to some new things? Who wants to start? Uli, what do you start with that?
I guess I would always say it's in your own hands to try things out. As you said, you can sign up to a few APIs, try things out. That is not the problem. The thing is, what people, I guess, what it would be useful to learn is to have a distanced look at your own workflows in a newsroom, and this is something everyone can do. And then have a look at some of the tools out there and see if they might be helpful. And if those workflows are fitting to those tools, or if this somehow clashes. This is something everyone feels when you're really working with production systems and when you're in the newsroom. This is not a management decision. It's a very practical question. And this is a question everyone can answer. And we need people in the newsroom who can answer those questions. I call that always a tech translator. These are the people we need in the newsroom, and these are the people we're looking for, because they are rooted in the newsroom, they know the workflows. And then you need someone who understands what's going out there, who understands the tools out there, and brings both together. And you can always become this person. This is really possible, and you don't have to be a coder for that.
It used to be, wasn't it? The journalists hit by tech change was go and learn to code, but GPT does that as well anyway, so I don't need to learn to code anymore. So, David, what's the advice?
This whole learn to code thing, which thankfully has sort of quietened down a bit, you know, I think the big advantage for a journalist learning to code is not that they would code, it's that they can learn to think in terms of abstractions. You know, I think that one of the big barriers here, both for organizations and for individual journalists, is that just that the job of journalism is about the arithmetic of creating news. It's about building a specific thing today, you know, an article, doing specific news gathering, and then tomorrow doing it again, and then the next day doing it again. Whereas, you know, what coding I think teaches is this abstraction, to look at it as a pattern. You know, what are the common things between the story you did yesterday, the story you're doing today, and the story you'll do tomorrow, and being able to use tools to deal with those common things rather than the specific things. And you have to have both, obviously, but I think that's a skill, that skill of sort of looking at the patterns and working with the patterns and abstracting. I think that's a kind of a meta skill that both individuals and organizations in this kind of new world would increasingly get value from.
Okay. I want to try and allow some time for people to ask questions. Before we do that, let's do that hands again. So who remains excited and positive about this? Hands up. And who's now worried? I think we lost a few worrieds, maybe.
Sorry about that.
We lost a few worrieds. So I think we've got a microphone somewhere. If anyone wants to ask a question, I think the microphone's coming to someone over there. There we go.
Thank you. Hi there. Hello, the room. You used many nice quotes, especially about optimism and what's coming up. I'm going to use another one that says that good technology first starts as magic and then slowly becomes basically invisible. So that when ChatGPT became mostly like publicly available and Midjourney and all that stuff, everybody was stunned and still stunned, and we're slowly this thing kind of fades away, but in a positive way. So I think we're going to keep doing this. And I really like the invisible part. I mean, you can think of driving your car. Nobody asks how the ABS works.
Yep.
You expect it to be there, hopefully. Or nobody asks about how GPS works and Google Maps and all that stuff. So my question is, imagine, let's use a ChatGPT prompt. Imagine you're a journalist in 2025. You work in a non-profit newsroom. You log into your CMS, WordPress, whatever, and you start setting up a new article. Where is ChatGPT hidden? All right. So, for example, we come from a digital startup. We are building an audience engagement platform with a survey platform, and we have hidden, let's say, ChatGPT in the part where you're creating new questions. So you use your link for your article, for your story, and it generates some questions. So it's hidden over there. On a journalist workflow, where else do you expect that it gets hidden? And summarization or whatever.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Uli, is this like a Microsoft Copilot approach? Is these two tools going to be embedded invisibly into the systems we use?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something we're thinking about, but not with ChatGPT right now, more or less, more with our own frameworks. About the point of seamlessness. As a product person, you want it to be seamless, and you want it to work, as you said, with the car. As a journalist who also covers AI and is an investigative journalist, there's also something troublesome in seamlessness because people stop to think about what they are using there. So it's crucially important that you have a disclaimer about what journalists are using there, and that journalists are really consciously using what they're using. And that we as product persons make sure that the systems are safer than ChatGPT is right now to embed it in the systems. So just said that. But I think what you just pointed out is absolutely the future. We are looking at embedding natural language generation in the core of our newsroom systems. For example, when you get your agency report, then you have your automated summary, you're having different headlines that are suggested. When you're writing about something, different articles from your systems are suggested to the authors that they don't have to do the research. Those are supporting tools, and we're absolutely thinking about that. Yeah.
Okay, have we got another question? Where the microphone's gone. Hey, fire.
Hi. I wonder, Mr. from the BBC, did you already, you already speak something about it, but codes of ethics, did you already think about to change it because of the AI and maybe some others as well?
Yeah, we have a set, a code of principles that are kind of, that the name will kind of give away how old they are. The machine learning ethical principles, and these are, kind of revisiting these after the whole, ChatGPT moment. They're absolutely as applicable now. They're publicly available. You can just sort of, search for BBC machine learning principles, and they're very straightforward and very practical. Human in the loop. We're always going to have a human in the loop. It's always going to be, eyes by an editor before going out the door. Always transparently labeled, these kind of things. I think these are very good, a basic starting point. It can be very, very simple in terms of policy and ethical guidelines. And then being aware of how, we're all learning about, as these capabilities develop, new ethical challenges arise, and sort of having the adaptability in policy and principles to deal with new situations as they arise. I think that's a challenge, and I think the BBC is doing extremely well with its policy teams and its machine learning policy people in preparing for that as well. I think they're some of the most sophisticated people on this at the BBC, which is great. So.
Okay, I think we've got time for one or two more.
Thanks so much. So 2 questions. I appreciate that you introduced the idea of metadata. So how do you envision working with corrections? Like one of the big challenges, especially with large language models, is if content is used for training data, the corrections never get as much attention as the original article. Are you thinking about how to embed that into, say, the metadata of original articles to improve large language models, but also then to integrate corrections, into the original articles? And then second, in terms of open data, so a lot of governments are moving towards open data. I was just did a panel at UCLA where someone was looking at the use of these data systems by journalists, and there's very low usage. Do you see that there's a role for some of these automated tools to make better use of all of these efforts to provide open data in order to encourage the continued provision of open data?
I'll start with that one because I built a whole journalism startup based on open data, and so it seemed to be an obvious and neglected news source because sometimes the skill base isn't available in small newsrooms to do it, and definitely not the time. So to build it separately was a way to do it and use data. And Jess, in turn to you, Gannett's got heavily into using open data as well, yeah?
I'm very excited about what these tools do to speed up the cleaning of this data and the maintenance of this data. And so I actually think, there is always the fear part of this, is it going to replace jobs? No, I think it actually makes editing and data journalism jobs more important because they can their output could be so much greater. So that part, I am excited about that piece of it. For the corrections, if you don't mind me jumping in, it's absolutely important to have a process for that and to be thinking through it and talking about it in your organization before you jump in and start publishing anything. So I really appreciate that question. We are short on time, but I just want to underscore the importance of the process and the workflows. Uli, you spoke to that. Around this, and then what does that mean? How people use it, what they use, and how our audience responds to it. So,
I think we're out of time. I'm being signaled that we need to wrap this. I'd like to thank my panelists, to David, to Uli, and to Jess, and to you all for coming along on a Sunday afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, one selfie, guys. One selfie.
One more?
What's selfie?
There,